So, welcome to United States History 2. This is week 6, entitled More Polish Than Rust, the Cold War. In April of 1945, President Franklin Delano Roosevelt died, and the Vice President, Harry S. Truman, became president. He would have a number of situations to deal with the end of World War II and, of course, the establishment of a new world order after that and dealing with what became known as the Cold War. The Cold War describes the tense relationship that existed between the United States and its allies on the one hand, and the Soviet Union and its allies on the other hand, following World War II and continuing until about 1989 through about 1991, with the fall of the Berlin Wall and the disintegration, finally, of the Soviet Union. Now, this was a bipolar world of the Cold War that pitted the principles of democracy and free market economies on the one hand against communism and its planned command economies on the other. The tense and insecure international order managed to avoid major confrontation of the size or scale of another world war, and hence was called the Cold War, because it never broke out into a hot war or a nuclear war, certainly. As Winston Churchill so eloquently yet realistically stated in a 1946 speech in Fulton, Missouri, Churchill said an iron curtain had fallen across Europe, dividing the free West from the communist East. Nevertheless, mounting anxieties were ventilated through three principal avenues. Number one, a buildup of nuclear forces by each side and an unprecedented militarization on a global scale. Two, what we might call close calls, frightening yet peacefully resolved powder kegs, potentially explosive international incidents which brought the world to the brink of nuclear holocaust. And number three, the policy of containment, which reached its climax in the eruption of contained conflicts that utilize conventional, that is, non-nuclear forces. This idea of containment was the policy of George F. Kennan, who was a United States specialist on all things dealing with the Soviet Union. He became known for his policy of containment, as he detailed in a 1947 article appearing in the journal Foreign Affairs. The USSR, that is the Soviet Union, what is currently Russia, he said, needed to be contained from expanding, meaning that the US had to provide a strong counterthrust to the thrust of communism. This would lead, he felt, to either, quote, the breakup or the gradual mellowing of Soviet power. In 1945, the United Nations was established. It had been agreed to at the Yalta Conference between Franklin Delano Roosevelt, Stalin, and Churchill. The Security Council of the United Nations would be composed of 5 permanent members, namely the major allies of World War II, being the United States, the Soviet Union, that is the Union of Soviet Socialist Republic, the USSR, the Great Britain, France, and China. In 1947, in the United States, the National Security Act created a Secretary of Defense position to oversee all branches of the U.S. Armed Forces, thereby streamlining things. A National Security Council was also created to advise the President on issues of national security. Another very famous program that came about was 1948, the Marshall Plan. The official name of the Marshall Plan was the European Recovery Program. It offered economic assistance to rebuild war-torn Western Europe. Although not originally conceived as such, the Marshall Plan was by the time of its implementation an instrument of the Cold War. It was designed partly to keep Western European nations from sinking economically, which in turn could threaten the foundations of democracy. Now, the United Nations was an example of collective security. That is the attempt to group a number of nations together for the purpose of security, where each nation would abide by the decision of the groups. Other examples would include 1949 NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, which was founded in 1949 and included the United States and its European allies in a military alliance. NATO, by the way, currently consists of 29 nations, and if you'd like to, you can go and read some information about it on its website. On the other hand, in 1955, the Warsaw Pact was founded, which included the Soviet Union and its Eastern European satellites that were sometimes called the Eastern Bloc states, also in a military alliance, again, part of the Cold War. Robert A. Taft was a Republican from the state of Ohio, and he was the leader of the Republicans in the U.S. Senate. He opposed a strong military presence in Europe, but a military presence was going to be necessary, as Truman and the Democrats determined. In Greece, a civil war was occurring. There was a leftist uprising there, and Britain was supporting the government but could no longer afford to do so. Likewise, in Turkey, the government was trying to resist Soviet pressures. Truman, with congressional support, sent $400 million in aid to Greece and Turkey, warning that if he did not do so, if the United States did not do so, that Greece and Turkey could fall like dominoes. This was the beginning of this theory, the domino theory, that if one nation fell to communism, another nation would fall. Just as if, as you were a kid, perhaps you set up dominoes in a line and you hit one and boom, 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 all the rest of them fell down. The U.S., Truman said, would provide aid to, quote, support free peoples who are resisting subjugation by armed minorities or by outside pressures, end quote. Now, at Yalta, okay, excuse me, so this was what was called the Truman Doctrine. That is that the United States would oppose communism and would aid free peoples. We did already talk about the Marshall Plan. And the Marshall Plan is an instance, again, really, of trying to prop up democracies in a capitalistic fashion in Western Europe so that they did not fall to communism. Now, at Yalta, another thing happened. FDR, Stalin, and Churchill had agreed to each control their own zones of occupation in Germany. Those zones of occupation were to be determined by the position of their troops at the time when the war ended. The zones were supposed to be, in the case of Germany, eventually reunited and free elections held, except this did not happen. So as you can see, the British, American, and French zones, and then over in the east where Berlin was, the Soviet zone. This would, by the way, the Soviet zone would become East Germany, the separate nation of East Germany, which was a communist Eastern Bloc country in the manner of the USSR and under the thumb of the USSR. And then the British, American, and French zones would eventually become what was known as West Germany. Similarly, the capital of Germany, which was Berlin, was to be divided into sectors: French, British, American, and Soviet. And the Soviet sector became East Berlin. These three sectors joined together and became West Berlin. East Berlin was communist. It was part of East Germany. In fact, it was located right smack in the middle of East Germany. And West Berlin was actually part of West Germany. It was free and democratic, but it was stuck right here in the middle of communist East Germany. Now, this would prove to be very problematic, as we'll see here in a moment. In 1949, the Federal Republic of Germany was created from the three zones that were occupied by the United States, the British, and the French. This was a response to the establishment of a communist puppet government in East Germany. So, at one point in time, the Soviets determined that they were going to block roads and railroads, into West Berlin. And so West Berlin would literally be kind of starved to death and forced to become part of East Germany. And this was in 1948 and 49. And of course, the United States could not sit by and let this happen. So the U.S. and British airlifted through their pilots, their air forces, 2.3 million tons of goods to sustain the West Berliners. The airlift finally ended when in 1949, the East Germans, the Soviets, simply said, we're going to open up the railroad and roads lines and allow you to supply. Literally, planes were landing, every minute and taking off every minute from West Berlin. This was called the Berlin Blockade, and it was an example, a very early example of those efforts to of actually problems that were occurring between the U.S. and its allies in the USSR and its allies. Hence, the Berlin blockade was a perfect evidence of the Cold War. Now, other examples of the Cold War would include the Vietnam War. And originally, Vietnam was part of what was called French Indochina. And that is, the French had the colonies of Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia. And in 1946, right after the end of World War II, Ho Chi Minh, a communist leader, began to harass the French in Vietnam. He and his communist rebels were known as the Viet Minh. In 1954, at the Battle of Dien Bien Phu, the French surrendered, and at a subsequent conference at Geneva, Vietnam was divided along the 17th parallel. And by that, it was divided into communist North Vietnam and, democratic free South Vietnam. The United States would become slowly involved and then ramp up under President Lyndon Baines Johnson its number of military advisors, and then it just had to drafted men from the United States to fight the Vietnamese. It was a war that we lost, and the United States troops withdrew in 1975. Another example of the Cold War occurred in Korea and is in fact still very evident in Korea. During World War II, both the United States and the Soviet Union had sent troops to Korea against their common enemy, the Japanese. After the war, Soviet troops occupied the North, what later on became North Korea for all intents and purposes, and American troops the South. The 38th parallel was the division line between the two, as seen here. Now, a communist government was formed in North Korea, and a pro-Western government was created in South Korea. Then in 1950, North Korea invaded South Korea. The United States sent troops to support South Korea, and the subsequent war, although Truman never asked Congress for an official declaration of war, it was nonetheless the Korean conflict, became an essential stalemate. 1.3 million troops were deployed. It was a UN, United Nations police action. It was enabled by the fact that the Security Council approved it because the USSR, that is the Soviet Union, boycotted the particular Security Council meeting when they decided for a police action there. Now, General Douglas MacArthur was the commander of the UN forces. He crossed the 38th parallel in 1950, but Truman told him not to cross the Korean-Chinese border. MacArthur actually came within 40 miles of this border, and 300,000 Chinese troops crossed south and helped chase with the North Koreans, the UN forces back across the 38th parallel. It took months for the UN forces to restore the 38th parallel. Truman wanted a settlement. MacArthur did not and took his position to the American people. Truman fired MacArthur in April of 1951. Peace talks dragged on for 2 more years. In 1953, an armistice was signed. The resulting truce line, our armistice line that you see here, of July 27, 1953. This became the official border between North and South Korea. And of course, you know that the current General Secretary of the Communist Party is Kim Jong-un. North Korea is a repressive regime with one of the largest armies in the world and a very active nuclear weapons program. Now, let's talk a little bit, get back now to domestic affairs, that is within the United States, now that we've talked a little bit about foreign affairs and the Cold War. So what really occurred is what has been called by Truman the fair deal. Truman wanted the peacetime post-World War II era to be marked by an expansion of New Deal programs, and hence he took the name the Fair Deal. He especially wanted housing and health care for the poor. But the Fair Deal really was partly doomed by the Cold War and by anti-communist hysteria that regarded such programs for the poor as socialistic. And of course, the Cold War also took away the emphasis on domestic affairs, largely distracted people from domestic affairs as well. Now, one thing that you need to know about a peacetime economy is that when a country is emerging out of a war which has been ended, it's always difficult for an economy to adjust from wartime production back to peacetime production. It doesn't happen overnight. Factories need some time to retool. You need to, acclimate, bring back the soldiers and acclimate them to the situation and find young soldiers jobs. If it is not controlled in some fashion, in a peacetime economy that's trying to retool and trying to adjust from wartime production to peacetime production, inflation can also take over. And that's because during World War II, in this instance, many people did without all kinds of consumer goods. For, literally several years, Detroit was not making any new automobiles. They were making tanks and airplanes and other things that were needed for the war effort. So there was this pent-up demand for all kinds of consumer goods. And, as the wartime production, the factories shift over to making, refrigerators and automobiles, etc. again. And people did fairly well during the war. They had jobs, they were prosperous, they saved up some money. Now they all of a sudden want to buy things. So this pent-up demand to buy things added to the fact that there were lots of wartime savings, about $30 billion in wartime savings, meant that too many dollars were chasing too few goods, which really is the definition of inflation. Now, there had been all kinds of wartime controls that had been set on rent and other prices during the war to keep inflation under control. And Truman wanted to extend those for a time, but Congress and businesses did not want that. Organized labor, in turn, was worried about losing some of the gains it had made during the war, and there were many strikes after World War II was over. And those strikes were designed to protect those gains. 5 million workers, for instance, went on strike in 1946, the largest number ever in the nation's history. They were especially concerned about losing overtime, which had meant as much as 30% of their take-home pay. And the strikes did result in about a 20% pay increase by the end of 1946, but many strikers lost overtime, and confounded by inflation, their purchasing power was really only slightly higher than it had been in 1942. There were also returning soldiers who needed jobs. Women in the workforce, some of whom did not want to return to lives of domesticity, that is, to the household. And so a very brilliant thing was developed, and that was the GI Bill in 1944. It was officially called the Servicemen's Readjustment Act, but people just referred to it as the GI Bill because it offered 16 million veterans, that is GIs, job training and education, unemployment compensation while they looked for jobs, and low-interest loans to purchase homes, farms, and small businesses. Already by 1948, some 1.3 million veterans had bought houses with government loans under the GI Bill, and 2.2 million veterans attended colleges on the GI Bill. Housing was scarce, with returning veterans sometimes living in people's basements and garages. Again, the GI Bill helped here. The Taft-Hartley Act was passed in 1947, sponsored by Senator Robert Taft of Ohio, and largely written by J. Max Swigert of the law firm of Taft, Stettinius, and Hollister of Cincinnati. Truman vetoed this bill, but Congress overrode his veto. Now, labor leaders did not like this Taft-Hartley Act at all. In fact, they referred to it deridingly as the Tough, Heartless Act. Although it continued to allow collective bargaining for labor unions, it made it more difficult for unions to form in a workplace by allowing states to pass right-to-work laws. And right-to-work laws prohibited that all workers join a union once a majority had voted for it. It also stipulated that unions and employers had to give 80 days notice of strikes to one another and to government officials. The president was given official power to intervene in strikes that would create a national emergency. In 1948, in the election, Truman, a Democrat, ran against Thomas Dewey, a Republican, and then versus Strom, they both ran against Strom Thurmond, who was from South Carolina and was with a racist party called the States' Right Party, or the Dixiecrats. Truman won election. In 1948, Congress passed the Housing Act of 1949, supporting the construction of over 800,000 government-owned housing units for the poor in the next 6 years. Well, the Cold War would continue, especially in the case of Ethel and Julius Rosenberg. This husband-wife team were communists, and they were accused of providing nuclear secrets to the Soviets in 1950. The Rosenbergs were found guilty and executed by electrocution in 1953, therefore becoming the first civilians in U.S. history executed for espionage. Since the fall of the USSR and the opening of the archives there, documents do in fact show that Julius Rosenberg had a role in this espionage. Ethel's brother, David Greenglass, who worked on the Manhattan Project, that was the nuclear bomb project at Los Alamos, New Mexico, passed secrets to Julius Rosenberg. Still uncertain, however, is the level of Ethel's involvement. David Greenglass, by the way, served 10 years of his 15-year sentence in prison. The U.S. Congress had a House Un-American Activities Committee, or HUAC, that began to investigate government officials and private persons of suspected ties to communism. And this included many stars, Hollywood stars. That's all for this week. If you have any questions, please feel free to contact me. Thank you.